Om Badram Karnebihi Shrunyama Devaha Badram Pashyema Akshabihi Rejatraha Sthirairangair Tushtuvam Sastanubihi Veshema Devahita Yadayuhu Swastinah Indro Vridrashravaha Swastinah Pusha Vishwavedaha Swastinah Tarksho Arishtanemihi Swastino Bruhaspatir Dadatu Om Shanti Shanti Shantihi Yo antah pravishya mama vacha imam prashuktam sanjeevayati akila shaktidhara swadamnam anyam shtahasta charana shravanatvagadin pranan namo bhagavate purushaya tubhyam lasatu shrimadananda tirtendurno hrudambare yadvachas chandrika swanta santapam vinikrantati padavakya pramana jnana pranamya shirasa gurun vyakarishe yata bhotam vishnu tattva vinirnayam. So, good evening, good morning, and good afternoon for friends who have joined for the fourth session of Atharvana Upanishad, or also called Mundaka Upanishad. So, we have done the following verses. Om Brahmo Devanam Pratamaha Sambhabhuva Vishwasya Karta Bhuvanasya Gopta Sabrahma Vidyam Sarva Vidyam Pratishtam Atharvaya Jeshtaputraya Praha Atharvane yam pravadeta brahma atharva tam purovacha angire brahma vidyam sa bharadvajaya satyavahaya praha bharadvajo angirase paravaram shaunako havai mahashalaha angirasam vidivat upasannaha papracha kasminnu bhagave vijnate sarvamidam vijnatam bhavati tasmai sahovacha dve vidye veditavye itihasmayat brahmavido vadanti paracha eva aparacha तत्र अपराऋग्वेदो यजुर्वेदः सामवेदो अथर्ववेदः शिक्षा कल्पो व्याकरणं निरुक्तं छन्दो ज्योतिषामिति अथ परा यया तद् अक्षरम् अधिगम्यते. So we have parked at this juncture and we are actually looking at this very, very important concept of Vedic philosophy for the past two classes. And it's quite a profound statement. Atapara yaya tad aksharam adhigamyate. So before we do that, where is this Mundaka Upanishad? It's part of the Atharvana Veda, is where the Mundaka Upanishad is. The overall structure of this Upanishad is what? It's got three Mundakas, Mundaka 1, 2, and 3, and each Mundaka has got two Khandas, 1 and 2. We are currently doing Khanda 1. So because Atharvana Veda has components of Rig Veda and Yajur Veda in it, throughout this Upanishad, you will see verses and you will also see prose. Padya and Gadya. You're going to see both of this as you navigate through this Upanishad. Okay. So before we do any Chintana of Upanishads, what do? We think about the Rishis who have given this knowledge down the generations. We think about the Devatas and we look about the Chandas. So the Rishi, the first few verses of Atharvana Veda has given us who are all the Rishis. We understood the Rishis of this Upanishad includes Atharva, Angira, Satyavaha, Angirasa, Shuanaka, and all the Acharyas who were given us Bhashyas, Tikas, and Tippanis, and so on. They all form the Rishis of this Upanishad. The Devata for this Upanishad is Aksharanamaka Paramatma. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about Aksharanamaka Paramatma last week. Yeah, so you may recall all the different meanings of Akshara that we discussed last week. So I just want to open this up very briefly. What do we understand by the word Akshara? What does it signify? So who wants to go on this, please? Just to wake us all up.
Eternal.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Who was that?
Ajit, eternal.
Eternal. Okay, Naksharati, something that is imperishable is eternal. Beautiful, Ajit. Thank you. Anybody else?
Tuksha, all the words, alphabets in the Sanskrit language, so covers everything in all the Vedas.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, Akshara, syllable, and the entire Veda. Excellent. Any other thoughts on Akshara?
Akshara, Madhuji, it's Padmaja.
Yeah.
Akshara is a liberator. It also means liberated soul, that is Lakshmi and Narayana.
Okay, thank you, Padmaja. Excellent, wonderful answer. Any other ideas about Akshara?
Aksha plus Ra. Aksha is sense organs, and one who dwells enjoys the good deeds that we do through our sense organs is Akshara.
Beautiful, Sureshji. Excellent. Thank you very much. Any other ideas? Because there's so many, meanings of Akshara, isn't it? So we're capturing all those beautiful concepts already. Anybody else? Any other idea?
One more I can say, Madhuji.
Yeah.
It is Akshara is one who fulfills all our wishes.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yes. Wonderful, Padmajaji. Thank you. So lots of answers coming through. So here is a summary slide. And we have actually discussed this already. So conventional sense, etymological sense. In the conventional sense, naksharati, anything that is imperishable or eternal. Hold on to that idea. Okay, that's really important. When I say akshara, I also mean that which is eternal or imperishable. Naksharati, as Ajit ji mentioned very first. That's a very important understanding of akshara. Then, of course, as Sushrut mentioned, the syllable Om, Bijakshara mantra that opens up into the entire Veda, which is A plus Ksha, Akara to Kshakara, is the syllables in Vedic Sanskrit. Then, of course, in the conventional sense, Akshara also means Mula Prakriti, because the Mula Prakriti is never destroyed. We may have all this gross manifestation during cycles of eternal creation, but that Mula Prakriti is always there. Okay, so there's a fundamental truth, isn't it? When people say, matter is never created and destroyed, it maybe converts into energy and energy back to matter. But that idea of something that is there, residual thing is never destroyed, is very true, which is what our Vedic philosophers have been telling all along. And they gave this Mula Prakriti the name Akshara. Then, of course, as Padmajaji mentioned, Chetana Prakriti or Lakshmi, who is the Abhimani of Mula Prakriti, is also called Akshara. And then in the highest sense, Vishnu is also called Akshara in the conventional sense. And in the etymological sense, Ashnute iti Aksharam, all that, the one that is all pervasive, is called Akshara. So that all pervasiveness will be in what? It can be in space, it can be in time, and it can be in gunas. So Avyakrita Akasha is all pervasive in space. Okay, that is different from Bhuta Akasha. We discussed this last week. So that Avyakrita Akasha is also called Akshara. Then Chetana Prakriti or Shri Tattva is also all pervasive in space and time. That is why she is called Samana, but she is also called Akshara. Whereas there is this third entity, Vishnu, who is not only in all pervasive in space, all pervasive in time, but also all pervasive in gunas or attributes. So that is why Vishnu is also called Akshara. Okay. Now then, of course, A plus Kshara, we understood liberated souls, as Padmajaji said. Shri Tattva and Vishnu and Lakshmi are always liberated. If we continue with our satsangs for maybe a few 10,000 or 1,000,000 lives, we might become liberated souls at some point. Akshara, as Sureshji was mentioning, Aksha is Indriyas, and that which is controls the Indriyas and enjoys it primarily is Vishnu, described in Gita again. Then that which is celebrated in the Veda, that Sushru talked about, is also called Akshara. Then that which fulfills our wishes, as Padmajaji was mentioning, Adhikam Sharanti, is also called Akshara. Okay. So in the chapter 15, of course, we have the beautiful illustration of, the Kshara Jivas, the Kutastha Akshara, and the most important Akshara, which is described in Gita. So Akshara, the word Akshara is really not to be taken lightly. We just need to think about the philosophy of this, because the whole of Vedic philosophy is compressed in this. And of course, our philosophy of the Gita is the summary of the Vedic philosophy, isn't it? It's the essence of the Upanishads. Yeah. So I think it's worthwhile to bring in, because in this forum, we always, when we do Upanishad studies, we should always think about it from a Prasthana Traya perspective. Gita is in the middle. Higher up is the Brahma Sutra, and on the other side is the Upanishads. So we need to bring all these three together whenever we do philosophical studies, particularly in the Upanishads. So linking the concept of Akshara to the philosophy of the Gita, I think, is very important. So I've just given a quick quiz here. What is the name of the chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita? So who is going to tell us? Very quick answer.
Sankhya Yoga.
Sankhya Yoga. Fantastic. Thank you, Shilaji. Sankhya Yoga. So in the Sankhya Yoga, the Sankhya aspect of Gita, of course, we are going to be dealing with all this in the sessions that Sureshji is going to lead. So in the Sankhya Yoga, just to remind you, verse 11 to verse 30 of chapter 2 talks about Sankhya. Yeah, I think it's a very important set of verses that gives you the foundation for Vedic philosophy. If we understand those verse 11 to verse 30 completely, then we will understand what is it that Angirasa is actually teaching Shuanaka here when he talks about Akshara. Because the thesis of eternality of souls are also called Aksharas, right? Which souls? As Padmajaji mentioned, the ones that are liberated are also called Aksharas, because souls primarily are eternal. So that is what in Gita chapter 2, Krishna is talking to Arjuna, right? Here he is explaining the eternality of souls. So the thesis of eternality of souls is made plausible by Krishna in Sankhya Yoga by giving examples of other eternal entities or aksharas in existence. So that is how he brings about this argument in Sankhya Yoga, particularly the Sankhya aspect. He gives examples. Look, Arjuna, there are other eternal entities in this existence. Similarly, the souls are also eternal. So he gives these examples. And if you carefully look at the examples that Krishna has given in chapter 2 Sankhya, it is all the aksharas that we have just discussed. Okay, so akshara is what? Naksharati, imperishable, that which is eternal. So Krishna says in Sankhya, there are other entities that are also akshara or naksharati or eternal. What are those? Mula prakriti. He talks about varna. He talks about avyakrita akasa. He talks about chetana prakriti. And of course, he talks about himself as the supreme akshara. So when you do these comparative studies, Sankhya Yoga becomes very, very interesting. And I hope that when we do Sankhya, we bring about the concept of akshara and look at it. Okay, so I've given those references here, but for want of time, let's move on. And as Padmajaji mentioned, the liberated souls are aksharas later, but they are first ksharas because they are in samsara and they have destructible gross bodies. That is why they are called ksharas. So that is a very important point. There are some transliterations that make that fundamental errors of calling aksharas as liberated souls for the 16th verse of chapter 15. No, akshara is only Vishnu and kutasto akshara. The souls are ksharas in samsara and they become aksharas only in liberation. So it needs to be qualified very, very carefully in Vedic philosophy. So the highest akshara is Vishnu. And what is Paravidya? Yaya? Let's go back to this slide. What does he say? Atapara yaya tad aksharam adigamyate, by which we can know about Vishnu or the highest akshara. The highest akshara is Vishnu and the Paravidya is Akshara Vidya. That Vidya that gives us the knowledge of the akshara is called Paravidya. So the idea there for this particular verse is, it says Atapara yaya tad aksharam adigamyate. So when we interpret the entire Vedas as celebrating Akshara only, then the Vedas become Paravidyas. Otherwise, what happens? Tatra Apara. We did that last week. What are all the Aparas? Tatra Apara Rigvedo, Yajurvedaha, Samavedo, Atharva Vedaha, Siksha Kalpo, Vyakaranam, Niruktam, Chando, Jyotishamiti, he said. All others were not understood as talking about Akshara, they become Aparavidya. Whereas when we understand that they actually talk about only Akshara, then it becomes Paravidya for us. Vedas themselves are always Paravidya. Swataha Pramanya, they are always Paravidya. It is only from the angle in which we look at it that becomes either a para or apara from our perspective. So this is a very, very important point about Paravidya and Aparavidya. Vedas are always Paravidya. But when we use a particular lens based on our own ignorance or knowledge, it can become Aparavidya for us or it can become Paravidya for us. Okay, so this is a key idea that you need to grasp because that is how the Vedic philosophy progresses. So Parama Samhita says, Rigadya apara vidya yata Vishnor na vachakaha. Ta eva parama vidya yada Vishnostu vachakaha. So when the Vedas talk about Vishnu, they become Paravidya, says Parama Samhita, which is cited by Acharya. When we interpret the entire Vedas as celebrated Akshara only, then it is Paravidya, worth always repeating it. And why do I say that? Look at Aitharva Upanishad, which is part of the Rig Veda, and it makes a very profound statement, which we have discussed in this forum on a number of occasions. Tava etaha sarvaha richaha sarve vedaha sarve goshaha eka eva vyahritihi prana eva prana richa iti eva vidyat. Aitharva Upanishad, it says every syllable, every rik, every words of the Vedas, the whole of the Vedas, all the sounds of the universe, they only celebrate this Paramatma or Akshara or Vishnu, says Aitharva Upanishad. Look at Kataka Upanishad. Sarve Vedaha Yatpadam Amananti. So the whole of the, we have done this, right? Yama is teaching Nachiketa here. Nachiketa Sarve Vedaha Yat Padam Amananti. The whole of the Vedas only talk about this Paramatma. To know these Vedas, what do people do? Tapamsi sarvani cha yadvadanti yat icchanto brahmacharyam charanti tatte padam sangrahena bravimi om ityetati. So that was the word, that was the verse Yama used when Nachiketa persisted on the third boon. Gita chapter 15:15. Vedaishta sarvai rahameva vedyaha. Very, very clear. The whole of the Vedas only talk about me, Krishna says to Arjuna. Okay. So you have these kind of very, very important verses of the Vedas themselves that say that the entire Veda talk about only Paramatma or Vishnu. Okay. Yet there are some folks that have made some differentiation in Vedas. Some folks think that only some portions of the Vedas are authoritative. A classic example is Mayavada philosophy. They feel that only certain portions of the Vedas are truth declaring, whereas the rest of the Vedas are non-truth declaring. Okay? So this goes against the spirit of what Yama has said in Kataka, or what Aitharva Upanishad is saying, or more importantly, what Krishna himself has said. Yet there are some folks who think that there are few verses in the Vedas that are Tattva Vedaka, and there are infinity minus 5 verses that are Atattva Vedaka, or not truth declaring. Okay? So this is an important idea that we need to think about it at this point of time. Is this a right approach? We leave it to them to make that decision as to whether it is a right approach or not. But it certainly goes against the spirit of the Upanishads themselves, the Veda Apaurushaya Vakya themselves saying the whole of the Vedas only talk about Paramatma. So things like, Aham Brahmasmi, Tattvamasi, Sadeva Somi Idamagrasi, Dekameva Advitiyam, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma, Tajjalaniti, Shanta Upasita, Ayamatma Brahma, Prajnanam Brahma. So these are all some of the sayings that this particular, the Mayavada philosophy thinks that only these 5 verses talk about some truth. It may not be about Akshara, it may not be about Vishnu, but it talks about some truth. Okay, but the rest of it is non-truth declaring. Okay? That again is not what Parama Samhita is telling us. Rigadya apara vidya yada Vishnurna vachakaha tava eva parama vidya yada Vishnostu vachakaha. So how do you kind of reconcile all this? Okay, so the first point there is, if only 5 of them are truth declaring, the rest of them are not, what a waste of space and time. It goes against Katha and Gita from where many of us see it. It also feels like an arrangement of convenience and not based on scriptural authority. Yeah? There is no authority in the Veda that gives this rule that you need to separate between Tattva Vedaka and Atattva Vedaka. That information needs to be out there for the serious seekers to be aware of. So this is a rules that this particular school of philosophy has designed for itself to fit its view of the universe. Okay? But then in Anuvyakyana, what Acharya does is he takes these verses, which apparently is truth declaring, and he resolves this Brahmatma Aikya very beautifully in Anuvyakyana. I'll just give this statement just to remind you. Swatantriyecha Vishishtatve Sthana Matya Aikyayorapi Sadrishyecha Aikyavak Samyak Savakasha Yateshtataha. Very, very clear statements as to how you interpret these 5 so-called Tattva Vedaka, but actually talking about Vishnu only. We are all one in this matter, opinion or thinking. We are stuck as one in the sinking ship. We are all one as Indians. When we look at this picture, we say it is a lion, but it is only a resemblance. So these are all the rules by which you interpret this so-called Tattva Vedakas. But that is for another day. But I just wanted to introduce this idea of how the division of Tattva Vedaka and Atattva Vedaka cannot be reconciled with the Vedic declaration that the whole of the Vedas only talk about Paramatma. Vedavyasa made a very important sutra called Gati Samanya. Gati means jnana. Gati means jnana, and Samanya means it is the same throughout the Vedic literature. It is the same. There is no difference with Atattva and Tattva Vedaka. That is a view of Sutrakara. That is a views of Badarayana. Okay? Everything talks about only about Akshara. Now here is another view. Some folk think some portions of the Vedas talk about Karma Kanda, and some portions of the Vedas talk about Jnana Kanda. And that is also debatable, because according to this view, even those verses that talk about karma or yajna, they actually talk about only Vishnu. So what I propose to do is, over the next 40 minutes that we have time, we'll try and look at this. Yeah, we can't, I mean, if we need to look at it in a whole scale discussion, it'll probably take a few weeks, but we will just look at an idea. So my aim here is to give you a perspective as to how you look at this when Angirasa said, Atapara yaya tad aksharam adhiganyate. Okay, so work with me on this, and hopefully we'll reach our destination by the end of today's class. So when we look at chapter 15:15, Vedashta sarvair ahameva vedyaha, basically what Krishna is telling is the whole of the Vedas only talk about me, mate. You need to interpret the Vedas properly. He is giving an instruction to Arjuna. You interpret the Vedas properly, then you will know that it talks only about me. So that introduces the idea of what is called Samanvaya of Shastra. So we need to be very, very careful when we understand the Vedas. Okay, so remember that technical term called Samanvaya, and I'm going to deal with that in the next few slides. So the next, of course, the big question is, how can all the Vedas be a source of knowledge of Akshara? Because it's a bit of a cryptic issue, isn't it? How can you do this? How can you interpret this? Okay, how can you interpret that the whole of the Vedas can only talk about Akshara? Because we do use, when we do various sacrifices, it will say, bring these utensils, put that one, so many sticks and all that. So how can those sticks that have been discussed in the Vedas can actually denote Akshara? So this is how the philosophers think about this very deep problem. Okay, this is where Vedavyasa comes to our rescue, and that is why Vedavyasa, Krishna Dvaipayana, Badarayana, is our founding father of the Vedantic system, because he has done us a huge favor by actually giving us a tool to interpret the Vedas properly so that we do Samanvaya of Shastra. So what is that? So we saw this one in the very first class, isn't it? When we were talking about what happened at the end of Dwapara Yuga, when much of the Vedas was lost. And then Vedavyasa took incarnation. Vedavyasa, who is an incarnation of Narayana himself, took incarnation. He came, he was born to Satyavati and Parashara. And then what did he do? He classified whatever Vedas that was remaining, and he gave it to his Sishyas. And then he asked them to look after it. Okay, so that we did. But is that all that he did? Is that all that he did? Just divided everything and then gave it to his Sishyas? No. He also gave us the interpretation of how to understand the Vedas. Not just the whole Vedas. I mean, when I say the whole Vedas, it of course includes, each sentence, word, letter, and sound. So if all these sentence, word, letter, and sound is an epithet of God, how do we interpret it as only talking about Akshara? So for us to do that, Vedavyasa composed a very, very important scripture for us to understand the Vedas. So I've got a very, very quick quiz here. What is that important scripture that Vedavyasa composed so that we can understand the Vedas properly? So who is going to take that very quick question?
Brahma Sutra.
And Brahma Sutras.
Okay, so all three answers. Perfect answer. So he composed this work called Brahma Sutra, which is what the Skanda Purana actually talks next. Chaturda vyabhajate tamshta chaturvimshatida punaha shatada cha ekada chaiva tataiva cha sahasrada krishno dvadashada chaiva punastasyartha vittaye chakara brahma sutrani yesham sutratvam anjasa alpaksharam asandiktam saravat vishwato mukam astobhyam anavadyam cha sutram sutravido viduhu सूत्रेषु येषु सर्वे अपि निर्णायः समुदीरितः शब्दजातस्य सर्वस्य यत् प्रमाणस्य निर्णयः. So these are all very, very important statements of Skanda Purana. It is not somebody else's, made up thing. The Skanda Purana talks about how Veda Vyasa wrote the Brahma Sutra and what is the definition of Brahma Sutra. There are six particular features of Brahma Sutra: Alpaksharam, Asandiktam, Saravat, Vishwatomukam, Astobam, Anavadyam. Alpaksharam means it's got few words. Asandiktam, free from doubts. Saravat, meaningful, full of philosophy. Vishwatomukam, wide meaning and wide application throughout the Vedas. Astobam, no unnecessary details, no unnecessary sounds or words. Anavadyam, free from flaws. So this is the definition of Brahma Sutra, which Veda Vyasa, who is Sarvajna himself, right? And he composed this so that we can understand the Vedas as Paravidya. Okay? And what is this Brahma Sutra? The Skanda Purana says this is a Nirnayaka Shastra. It is the supreme court of Vedic philosophy. It gives you the final judgment of how you interpret a verse in the Upanishads, how you interpret a word in maybe one of the Aranyakas, and so on. So it gives you those rules of interpretation. So Brahma Sutra is the manual for the interpretation of the Vedas. Without Brahma Sutra, without having this Vedanta Sutra, if one goes and tackles the Vedas, all sorts of nonsensical meanings will come up. So we need to be very, very careful with regards to how we interpret the Vedas. Always has to be done with the manual of Vedanta Sutra, which Veda Vyasa has given. So I'm going to ask one of us to recite 13.5, please. And then we will get 15, the first verse to be recited as well. So who wants to go for 13.5? Thank you.
Yeah, Madhuri, shall I go?
Yeah.
ऋषिभिर्बहुधा गीतं छन्दोभिर्विविधैः पृथक् ब्रह्मसूत्रपदश्चैव हेतुमद्भिर्विनिश्चितैः.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Veenaji. So in 13.5, Krishna has very clearly stated there are all these Vedas, but you use Brahma Sutra to actually understand it. Brahma Sutra is the tool by which you understand the Vedas. Krishna has very, very categorically said. Krishna, of course, is Veda Vyasa himself. Who wants to do the 15.15 again?
Shall I, Madhuri?
Yeah.
Vedaishcha sarvairahmeva vedyo Vedanta Veda Videva Chaham.
Thank you. Beautiful, Shilaji. So he said, I know all the Vedas, but I did not compose the Vedas. Vedanta Krit, Vedanta Sutra, I composed. And that Vedanta Sutra is also called Brahma Sutra, which is used to interpret the Vedas. So the internal evidence in the Gita is categorical as to how we have to interpret the Vedas. Yeah, there can be no second questions about it. So the Vedas should be understood only through the lens of the Brahma Sutra. So if there is one message from today's talk, it is this. We have to interpret the Vedas only through the lens of Brahma Sutra. Okay. So then, of course, we have the Prasthana Trayas, right? That's for another day. So, but all the Acharyas have taken any Vedantic philosophy that you want to bring forward to explain existence, you have to take evidence from Prasthana Traya, which is Sutra Prasthana, Upanishad Prasthana, and Gita Prasthana. Okay. Srimad Acharya in Anuvyakhyana has given a highest position to Brahma Sutra. Paravidyakyam Chakre Shastram Anuttamam. Okay. It is the highest, at least in Tattvavada school of philosophy. The Brahma Sutra becomes a very important text. Okay. So that Brahma Sutra, it gets its, so here, I mean, we don't have time to go through this in everything, but I'll just read this. Vaktru Shotru Prasaktinam Yad Aptir Anukulataya Apti Vakyataya Tena Shruti Mulataya Tata Yukti Mulataya Chaiva Pramanyam Trividam Mahat Drishyate Brahma Sutranam Ekada Anyatra Sarvashaha Ato Neitadrisham Kinchit Pramanatamam Ishyate. So that is, the last line is very beautiful. There is no scripture that is equivalent to Brahma Sutra. Its highest level of authority comes from Apti Mulataya, Shruti Mulataya, and Yukti Mulataya. Apti Vakyataya. Why is it Apti Vakyataya? Anybody wants to do? Apti means a very authoritative composer. So why do we think Veda Vyasa is an authoritative composer? Somebody can say that Veda Vyasa is like an ordinary, human being, a rishi. Believe me, some folks think that. They think Veda Vyasa is an ordinary rishi. Okay, it's really sad that they think that way, but that is their problem. But why is Brahma Sutra considered as a composition by an Apta, the highest qualified? Who wants to take this? Very quick question.
I think it has got all the main points of Upanishads. I mean Vedas.
That is Shruti Mulataya.
He has given it in a cryptic form, I think you said, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Shilaji said that what you're saying is Shruti Mulataya, that the evidence is all from the Shruti, the Vedas.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Veda Vyasa is Vishnu himself. So whatever there can be no one above him. He is the ultimate. So what he says has to be the ultimate truth.
No, but Sushruth, I'm just going to tackle you there. I'm going to say, who said Vishnu is the highest? Prakashji.
Okay, it goes like this. Even though Veda Vyasa did not compose the Veda because it's Anadi and it's unauthored, Apurusheya, whatever the works Veda Vyasa has done, they are in line with the Vedas, meaning they don't oppose the Vedas or they don't go, say something which is totally different from Veda. That is why the Brahma Sutras, they give us a scope to understand the Vedas correctly because he knows the Vedas, and it is in line with the Vedas. Whether it is Puranas or Mahabharata, Itihasas, everything, they are in line with the Vedas. That is why it is, even though it's an Aptavakya, it is in line with the Vedas, which is the Shruti Mula. So that is why Veda Vyasa's works is correct. And also Vishnu, Sarvatma, and all the next thing. But I'm not going to say about that.
Yeah, thank you, Prakashji. So yes, so many ideas have been captured by both Sushruth and Prakashji. So the other thing is, Sushruth, just think about this possibility. If some fellow says, okay, if you say Badarayana is an incarnation of Vishnu, okay, how do you know that Vishnu is Sarvajna? I'm saying Vishnu is Sabala Brahman. He actually does not exist. Okay, he's a Saguna Brahman, and he actually does not exist. That is also possible, right? So the answer there is you have to find evidence within the Vedas themselves which talk about Vishnu as Sarvajna. Yes, Sarvajnaha, Sarvavit, Jnanatapam Mayaha, Taittiriya Upanishad. So it talks about yes, Sarvajnaha, Sarvavit. This Paramatma is Sarvajna. And as Prakashji said, he knows all the Vedas. Vejashta Sarvair Ahameva Vedyaha. Why did Krishna say that? Because he is Sarvajna. Vedas are infinite. He is the only person who can know the Vedas. So Apti, the qualification comes from Sarvajnatva. So for those who are interested in the idea of how can you establish somebody as Apta, you should go to Vishnu Tattva Nirnaya Paricheda 1, where this is discussed in great detail. But that's for another day. But Apti, Badarayana is Apta, Shruti takes from Shruti, Yukti, it's full of logic. So that is why we think Brahma Sutra is the highest source of authority that we use. That is the lens that we use to understand the Vedas. Okay, so we have done these sessions around Brahma Sutra some couple of years ago. So this is just a summary overview to remind you as to what this is. So Brahma Sutra has got adhyayas. There are 4 adhyayas. Look at the first adhyaya, Samanvaya Adhyaya. Okay, Samanvaya Adhyaya, Avirodha Adhyaya, Sadhana Adhyaya, Phala Adhyaya. Samanvaya Adhyaya is the first adhyaya that actually gives you the rules of interpretations of the Vedas so that they talk only about Akshara. It's got 4 padas, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each pada has got so many adhikaranas. Okay, if you put the whole Brahma Sutra together, it comes to 564 aphorisms. And if you remember, at some point we did, if the numerology of Brahma Sutra, if you take 564, It's actually Vashana of the aksharas of Sanskrit. Vashana becomes Vishnu. So the 564 aphorisms of Brahma Sutra primarily talks only about Vishnu. Okay. So if you look at the first Adhyaya, it's called Samanvaya Adhyaya. It's called 135 sutras. So I'm as I said, I'm just giving you an overview. Okay, go back to those slides. We did Panchadhikarini, the first 5 Adhikaranas we did 2 years ago. So there is the 4th sutra in the Samanvaya called Tat Tu Samanvayat. Okay, Tat Tu Samanvayat. So to understand Tat is what? Tat is Tataha. Tataha means what? That which is all pervasive. That which is all pervasive with what? Time, space, and gunas. Who is all pervasive? Ashnute iti aksharam. So if you want to know that akshara, tu means it's evakara, it stresses. To know that tatanama akshara, you have to do samanvaya of the shastra. Samanvaya means what? Sam plus anvaya. Samyak means you have to do it very well. It's like Sankhya yoga, right? Sankhya means what? Samyak Khyati. So similar kind of ideas. Samyak. Sampurna, the whole of the Vedas, you have to do Anvaya. Okay. So so Raghavendra Yati, for example, he gives a etymology of what Samanvaya means. What is the etymology of Samanvaya? Samyak Anviyante Yebihi. So these, what are these? These rules of interpretation that allows you to make Samanvaya of the Shastra so that you know about this Paramatma. Okay, so the Samanvaya becomes very important. So this is a complicated slide, but my idea here is to introduce you some thoughts as to what is the science of interpretation. Okay, it is not arbitrary, as some folks do. It cannot be arbitrary interpretation of the Vedas to suit your philosophy. That is not how Vedic interpretations are done, because there are well-defined rules of interpretation. So they are called Tatparya Lingas. So if you can keep this in your mind, do some research on this. So in the Bhashya, Acharya will say Anvaya Upapatyadi Lingam. So what are these? Brihat Samhita gives an explanation of that, but I'll give you the list. Upakrama, Upasamhara, Abhyasa, Apurvata, Phalam, Arthavada, Upapatti. So these are all the Tatparya Lingas that one uses to understand the Vedas. Okay. So it is not for the faint-hearted. So we actually need to spend time and dedication to understand through a Guru Mukha. We have to use a guru to understand all this. What is the introduction to this particular Vedic passage? What is the conclusion of this Vedic passage? What are all the ideas that are repeatedly discussed in the Vedic passage? Is there some novel idea that is being brought forward in the Vedic passage? By knowing this, understanding this Vedic passage, is there any benefit to the jivas? Okay, and what are the vidhis and what are the nishedas that have been given? So this is called Arthavada, and again that has got 4 subdivisions: Ninda, Stuti, Parakriti, Purakalpa, etc. And then logical justification. This is what acharyas do, to use these rules and then understand how the Vedas actually talk only about Akshara. Okay, so we need to do a lot of homework on these kinds of rules of interpretation. I agree that these are complicated, but at least we need to have an appreciation of how the Vedas should be interpreted, because they need to use these kind of rules. And these have all been described in Purva Mimamsa Sutras. Okay, so these are not somebody's invention. There are sutras to talk about how you interpret the Vedas, not only Brahma Sutra. Okay, so then you also use this concept of contextual relevance that I want to bring. So when you're talking about a philosophy, or when you're talking about an idea, yeah, you want to look at various rules there. You want to look at the Shruti, you want to look at Linga, you want to look at what is called Vakya, what is Prakarana, what is Sthana, what is Samakya. In brief, what it means is, if you take a book, the book will have a scope. Then if you take individual chapters, they will have a scope. In each chapter, there may be subsection. Each section will have a scope of discussion. And the contextual relevance of everything also becomes very, very important. So prakarana, for example, is very, very important. In a work called Tattva Prakashika, Jayatirtha Muni talks about this. So those of us interested, we can go and look at it. But what I want to do here is just spend a couple of minutes talking about prakarana or contextual relevance. This is very, very foundational for scriptural interpretation. We cannot just take Tattvamasi, pluck it out and say, I am Brahman. We cannot say Aham Brahmasmi, pluck it out from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and say, I am Brahman. We cannot say Ekameva Advityam out of Chandogya Upanishad, pluck it out and say that nothing else exists except this Brahman. Okay? We cannot pluck these things out of context. What we have to do is we have to see them in the context as to in what context these words are coming and then understand. So if you go back to our Chandogya Upanishad or when we did Samanvaya Sutra and Brahma Sutra, we've kind of tackled all these issues. So my intention here is to say, let's not submit ourselves to blind dogma. What we need to do is make our own individual effort and then use the rules of interpretation. We have all these kind of, algorithms at work, isn't it? We use all these rules at work. And sometimes I'm amazed as to why people don't use those kind of rules in scriptural interpretation rather than following blind dogma. So my humble submission here is, let's do things properly. Use properly the interpretation devised by our acharyas and all the previous scriptures that have given us the rules of interpretation. There are also things called Niravakasha and Savakasha. And we have discussed that a few times. So I'm going to break for a minute. Who is going to tell us what is Niravakasha Shruti and what is Savakasha Shruti?
Namaskara.
Shall I
Prakash.
try from what you have told once? Because I may not be perfect, but
So,
Niravakasha Shruti means you said it talks only about Supreme and it has got only one meaning. And Savakasha Stuti also talks about Brahman alone, but there can be many meanings and interpreted in many ways.
thank you, Shilaji. Prakashji, you were also going to say?
No, I was almost, she have told the same thing. Niravakasha, Avakasha means there is a scope. Niravakasha means there's no scope for alternate thing. That's all.
Yeah. So the Niravakasha, Shavakasha is a very, very key rules of interpretation. Yeah. When I say Dvasuparna Sayuja Sakaya, that is Niravakasha Shruti. Whereas when I say Sayayesha Anima Aitadatmyam Idam Sarvam Tat Satyam Sa Atma Tattvamasi Shvetaketo, that is a Savakasha Shruti. There are so many other interpretations of that. So these are all the nuances of Vedic interpretation that you can spend a whole lifetime talking about. Then, of course, you have something called Upajivya and Upajivaka. Pramanya Prabalya. So when there are material things that we need to talk about, our Pratyaksha is a more important Pramana. But when you want to talk about non-material things, it is Vedas that are Pramanas. So those are all the rules. Upajivya and Upajivaka in what context? So you can look at all these things. So that is the a brief overview of the rules of interpretation. But here is a slight different idea. So I've told you about these words, right? We have said Ata Yaya Tad Aksharam Adigamyate, Ata Para Yaya Tad Aksharam Adigamyate. What is it? All the words of the Vedas, when they talk about Paramatma or Akshara, then they become Paravidya, right? But what are these words? Let us look at the science of language. So that itself is complicated. And this is the beauty of Vedic philosophy, because they've looked at all these aspects in great detail. So they look at the words and their meanings. The power of words to give a meaning is called vritti. Yeah. And there are two types of vrittis. There's something called mukhya vritti. There is something called lakshana vritti. So this we know from in our English language itself, metaphors and similes, they are lakshana vritti. I.e., this man is like a lion, is a amukhya vakya or lakshana vritti. He is not actually a lion, but we say he is like a lion because he roars, he is very strong and he is very aggressive, whatever. To give those ideas, we use those kind of metaphors, right? So they all come in lakshana vritti, and in Vedas, there are a lot of lakshana vrittis that you need to watch. Then there is the mukhya vritti or the meaning of the words. Okay? So that can be conventional, which is called rudi. That can be etymological, which is called yoga, or it can be both. So rudi, yoga, yoga, rudi. Okay. Then, of course, there is a higher level of interpretation, which is what Angirasa is asking, is telling Shuanaka, is something called Paramamukya Vritti. Okay, think about these ideas of meanings of language. Yeah, say, for example, there is a coconut on this tree. This is called a coconut. But if I take the green thing and I peel it out and I look at this is also called coconut. But if I break it open and if I look at the white pulp, that is also called coconut. So it depends on the levels of interpretation. This is a classic example of how our teachers tell us how to understand this Paramamukya Vritti. Okay, so think about these ideas. Okay, so the algorithm of interpretation of scriptures is next. As I told you, if it is non-material, we have to go to Vedas. So first you go to the Vedas. Then you ask the question, is it a Niravakasha Shruti or a Savakasha Shruti? If this is Niravakasha Shruti, what it says is Pramana or authoritative. If it is a Savakasha Shruti, then you use criteria of Tatparya Lingas and Purvamimamsa Sutras and arrive at a logical meaning of what the Vedas tell you. Okay, so when you do all that, okay, you will consistently find Ataparayaya Tadaksharam Adhigamyate. You can do your experiments. Always it will go to Akshara only when you do these interpretations and use Paramamukya Vritti. Okay, so I hope this is helpful for you to ruminate over the next several days. But these are all the ideas that Angirasa is thinking about when he is talking to Shuanaka. So without understanding this, it will be very difficult for us to move to the next verse. Okay? So that's why I'm spending a lot of time to give this idea. So here is a major view of how this Samanvaya actually happens. So what did we say? Creation, pre-creation, singularity, then there is a Big Bang and all the stuff is coming out in the universe. They're all gross modification, various gross objects are being made. How does this universe comes into being? We are told that Paramatma says Om, and then the vibration brings about the modifications of the universe. And we've also learned in our satsang that Om expands into so many things, including Padya, Gadya, and Gana, Rig, Yaju, Sama, all the languages and all the sounds. And then if you can remember in Chandogya Upanishad, when we did Trivirat Karana and how Nama Rupa Vyakarana happened, how did the universe came about? Nama Rupa Vyakarana. So each gross object that is made in the universe is linked to a Nama, a sound. Every object in the universe will have a name linked to it. So that is also called creation, Nama Rupa Vyakarana. So now you can start thinking about the Samanvaya as to how it actually happens. Although all these sounds only denote the Paramatma, all these sounds, as the objects of the universe are created, they are also attached to the individual objects of the universe. And that word then becomes a Mukhya Vritti. It denotes those objects in the universe. But primarily they are Paramamukya Vritti because they only talk about Brahman. So that is what is the Samanvaya that you need to do, which is a higher levels of philosophy in which you understand what Angirasa is saying, Ataparayaya Tadaksharam Adhigamyate. Okay, so I hope this made, it's a complex way of looking at it, but that is the only way of looking at this as to why Angirasa said Ataparayaya Tadaksharam Adhigamyate. Okay, so the next question is, we said, what about all the sacrifices? Okay, how can all these sacrifices, last week we did this, isn't it? We listened to this very first verse of Yajurveda, where they are saying, go and break the stake, drive the cows to graze the field, separate the calves, let these cows give us a lot of milk, and let that milk become butter, and that butter give us energy. May we have a lot of cows, may these cows be protected, may these cows not be slaughtered. No, all these things this very first verse talks about. How can that become Paravidya? So in the next 10-15 minutes that we have, I'll try and very quickly run through this. Okay. So again, Brahma Sutra has sorted this out for us. Yeah, there are some very important sutras of Brahma Sutra that are given here. But the approach there has got two approaches. One is, as I said before, Tava Yeta Sarvaha Richaha Sarve Vedaha Sarve Goshaha Eka Eva Vyahratihi Prana Eva Prana Richa Iti Eva Vidya. That we have done. All sounds talk about the universe. So in that sense, these sounds of Yajurveda also talks about Brahman. So that is one view. Sutakara again gives rules of interpretation of it. Jyotir upakrama tu tata hi adiyata eke. Check this sutra out that talks about this. How do you go about doing this? Okay. But then here is a very practical approach that I like. Approach 2 that again Vedavyasa gives, citing his sishyas, his students. Okay. So he had so many students, right? One guy is Jaimini, whom we know propagated Purva Mimamsa, lot of rituals. Then Ashmaratyaha, Audulomihi, Kashakritsnaha. So these are all students of Badarayana. And Badarayana cites them. Anyartam tu Jaiminihi, Vakya Anvayat, Pratigna Siddher, Lingam Ashmaratyaha, Utkramishyata Evam Bhavad Iti, Audulomihi, Avastiteriti Kashakritsnaha. So he gives all these rules. I've just done an English interpretation for our benefit. When does the rites, when does the sacrifice or the actions that we do become Paravidya? If the rituals, if the rites and rituals lead to the knowledge of Brahman, then that becomes Paravidya. Scriptural words, in their worldly sense, describe the scope and limitation of pursuing sacrifice, but they create a sense of aversion and encourage to pursue the knowledge of Brahman, says Ashmaratyaha. Rituals can cleanse the mind and promote the seeker to the gain knowledge of Brahman, says Audulomihi. Rites, deities, and all other things exist in Brahman, who is their supporter. In order for us to understand the supporter, the scriptural words connote the supported world, says Kashakritsnaha. So all these words of scripture, of sacrifice, can also denote Brahman. So here is another way of looking at it. How can rituals be Paravidya? When Yajurveda says, Yajamanasya Pashun Pahi, let the cows be protected. How can that become Paravidya? Okay. Paravidya how? Praja. Praja stands for Prajna, knowledge. Pashu, Panti plus Shu, protects and gives Ananda. Veda is also called Gau. Gau means Vedas. Okay. Gau, protection of cows, essentially means protection of Vedas. Okay. Gau means Veda. Yashas, Ya plus Sha, Yam plus Sham, Jnana and Ananda. Yajamana, he who does Yajna. Who is Yajna? Yajno vai Vishnuhu, says Saitreya Aranyaka. Vishnu Sahasranama, the 48th name of Vishnu is Yajna. 924. Anybody wants to take 924, please?
Yeah. Aham hi sarva yajnanam bhokta cha prabhurev cha natu mam abhijananti tatve nashantya vantite.
Thank you, Neetaji. So Krishna said, Aham hi sarva yajnanam. Okay. Yajno vai Vishnuhu. Yajna is my name, says Vishnu Sahasranama. Purusha Shukta, last one. Yajnena yajnam ayajanta devaha. So when you do all this, so that is how you do the samanvaya there and understand any yajna can be Paramatma. Okay. And then, of course, in Katha Upanishad, we also spoke about how many bricks, Ya Ishtakaha, Yavatirva, and all that. You remember how many bricks and so on. And those bricks, why there is 360, how many bones are there in the body, how many times, how many days, and all the 360 we have done. So that also becomes Paravidya. When these rules are there for sacrificial rites, those rules, when you go deeper in, they actually talks about Paravidya, to know about Paramatma. So we look this, right? So Aparavidya should always lead to Paravidya. If you are stuck at Aparavidya, it will always remain an Aparavidya. But we understand and transform it to know about Paramatma, then it becomes Aparavidya. It is like a Calpol solution, as I said. The paracetamol is the Paravidya, whereas the strawberry flavor is the Aparavidya there. If you're a surgeon, like many of us, many of you in this group, hand washing is essential before surgery, but that is just a apara vidya. You don't accomplish anything just by hand washing to a patient who is on the table. So this is where this rules becomes very important. We can transform material science to paravidya. How is that possible? If I'm just hand washing before surgery, it is just a preparation. Okay, I am doing this surgery. So when I say I have trained for so many years, I am using this skill, so I am doing this surgery for this benefit. So what a great surgeon I am. When we think like that, it becomes aparavidya. But when you are doing surgery, you say you are aware of the position of the jiva as a dependent doer, and you are doing this surgery as a service to God. That becomes paravidya in our daily life. So I just taken a common example for this group as to how we do our daily activity. It may not be a surgeon, it could be an IT specialist, it could be anybody. When we do it with this perspective, I am a jiva, but inside me is an antaryamin, who is an independent controller of all that I am doing. So it is the Paramatma who is doing this surgery, but I am doing it as a service to Paramatma, as a dependent soul on Paramatma. So when you do that, that becomes Paravidya. When Stephen Hawking talks about the theoretical physics and on the origin of the universe and how complicated it is with all these various formulas and so on, that is Aparavidya, period. That is Aparavidya. It does not give us liberation. It may be an interesting hypothesis. But when Acharya said in the Dwadasha Stotra, Bahuchitra Jagad Bahuda Karanat Parashaktihi Ananta Gunaha Paramaha. This universe is complex, Bahuchitra Jagad. That is Aparavidya, material science. We can be all sorts of scientists to understand why this universe is complex. But when we understand that there is a great creator behind it, Bahuda Karanat Parashaktihi Ananta Gunaha Paramaha. When we know that there is this entity that is the efficient cause of this universe, then that becomes Paravidya. When William Paley picked up this watch, if he just understood that there was a watchmaker who made the watch, that is Aparavidya. But when we take this watch as this universe, which is such an intricate thing, so if this is such an intricate thing that the universe is operating, there must be a watchmaker for this universe, then that becomes Paravidya. Okay. So I'm going to stop there because this Paravidya concept is far too complicated and far too deep for us to understand. So what I hope I've done today is I've given you this overarching approach to Akshara. Then we discussed how the Samanvaya, what is Samanvaya? We discussed how Vedanta Sutra becomes important for Samanvaya. Then we understood how important Vedanta Sutra, Brahma Sutra is to understand the words of the Vedas so that they only talk about Akshara. Then we also looked at how can various sacrifices that we do in our daily lives can become from Aparavidya to Paravidya. So we have done all that. Now, the next one that the only other thing that is left in this Paravidya, Aparavidya equation is to actually think about Devata Upasana, because they talk about, the Vedas talk about various deities like Ganesha. Ganesh Chaturthi is coming up tomorrow. So Ganesha, Shiva, Rudra, Subramanya, you name it. So how do we understand that? What is their role in Para and Aparavidya? We'll talk about it in the following sessions. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. As I said, there is so much to talk about. I've got so many slides here. So, but I'm going to close there. Krishna Pranamastu. If you have any pressing questions, we'll take it up for a minute because we got Neeta and Veena ji coming up to talk to us about their Gita recitation plans for the next several months. So any questions at this point? Okay, if there are no questions, I'm going to close at this point. Krishna Pranamastu. I hope you found this session interesting. It's a bit complicated, but go back and think about these ideas because this is foundation for Vedic philosophy. Without this, it's very difficult to understand the Vedas. Okay, so I'll stop at that point, and I'm also going to stop recording.